Take the moment to introduce our guest speaker this week, Laura Hansplant. She is a landscape architect and principal at Studio Sustena here in Philadelphia. For the past 30 years, she has focused on integrating ecology and design for master plans, for mission-focused institutions, to rooftop parks, to site designs for academic campuses in Chester County, Westchester, and Glassboro, New Jersey. Her career highlights include the opportunity to collaborate on Sierra Green, the University of Toronto's King's College Road, and the Visitor Center at the Gettysburg National Military Park Museum. She absolutely loves leading a small, dynamic studio focused on blending creativity and technical insight. Laura is passionate about understanding how sites function in ways that are healthy and evocative of their inherent beauty. Her current work explores the pattern language of resilience at the planting scale and at the site scale. So we're very excited to have her here, and I'll pass it over to her. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of these discussions. I love learning and I love hearing what other people are thinking about and passionate about in design. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Still coming up for me, but it's ready to share, I think. Yep, there it is.
Awesome. So yeah, so I am a landscape architect. I actually wanted to be an artist, but I also wanted to be an environmental scientist. And so I found my way into design. And I think a lot about resilience, and I think a lot about how systems work. I think it comes from having a background in ecology and also about hiking and getting out into as many natural places as I can. So let's see here. So this is a topic of conversation among my colleagues and I. What is resiliency? What does it mean to think about resiliency at a site scale? I particularly like this quote. I think it's provocative, maybe overstated, but I think resilience means different things to different people. So here's a definition. You can find variations on that. And when I ask people, what does resilience mean to you? I get different answers. People might say, hey, I'd like to think about how my site or my building withstands extreme weather events. And so we're talking there about risk management. And that's really valid. We might talk about the ability of a system or a site to bounce back from some extreme event or unexpected event, or even just the real range in weather, dry to wet, that we get right now. And that's really about recovery. That's also true. This is my favorite. This is from psychology. The ability not only to recover and bounce back, to emerge stronger. And wouldn't that be amazing if our buildings and our sites, through our ability to build resilience into design, could emerge stronger and adapt? How do we design for adaptation? So I like to canoe. I don't know if anybody else here canoes or kayaks or otherwise boats, but there's an important concept that's easy for me to understand through the analogy of boat design, which is the contrast between initial stability and dynamic stability. And we find this in ecology. So if you're like the guy at the top picture who's fly fishing, if you're new to canoeing, you're going to want a canoe that has a fairly flat bottom and has good initial stability. When you get into it, it doesn't move very much. It feels really solid. If you're canoeing, if you're a more experienced canoeist or you're canoeing in rougher water, you're going to want a canoe with a rounded bottom that has dynamic stability. When you first get in it, that canoe is going to rock back and forth a lot. It's kind of alarming if you're not used to it. But what happens is that when you get into rough water, look at the orange line for the center of gravity. A flat bottom boat, center of gravity really heels over, and it's much more likely to tip. Whereas a round bottom boat, because it's so rocky, its center of gravity remains more upright and it's going to recover. And so I would hypothesize that what we need to be doing in design is not designing flat bottom boats. We need to design round bottom boats, and we need to be designing for dynamic stability. You all with me so far? That makes sense? So what does that look like? So here's like a super easy example. We're going to dig into this. The picture on the left, I love this planting composition. It's beautiful. It's not mine, but I admire it. But it has a very high initial stability. It's a flat bottom boat, and this is how we're taught to design. Everything's meant to stay where you place it. Whereas the picture on the right is designed for adaptability. And plants are meant to move a little bit. There might be ebb and flow. It's still playing with textures, but over time it might change a little bit. That's a round bottom boat. That's dynamic stability. And so I think one of the dilemmas we have as designers is that we're taught traditionally, we design the way we're taught. And we're taught to design with fixed compositions as an artist, as the visionary in the design. And we're taught to focus on excellence in plants and materials. And what we really need to be thinking about is how to design for dynamic communities. And I work a lot with plant communities, but we can also talk a little bit about social structure too. So I'm going to give some examples and dig into this in like the little bit of time we have, and it's going to go super fast. And I want to touch on 4 key points. Everything interconnects. We're talking about integrated design. That's probably familiar. The middle zone is the one that counts, and we need to slow water down. And I'm going to pull from ecology for that one. And then I'm going to come back to dynamic compositions. So everything interconnects. So forgive me, Karen. I'm showing some pictures of a familiar project. This is a building on a campus out in Chester County. And what's happening here in the site design is that, we have a new road, we have a new building, and kind of site design and pathways you might expect. And we're talking about here 2 things in play in terms of resiliency. One is stormwater management below the new driveway. And the second is converting lawn to meadow. And we get a couple things that start to interact here. First is that by converting lawn to meadow, you have less runoff, so you can optimize the size of your stormwater system and reduce its footprint. And the second is you're starting to make water available deep in the soil for existing trees. And one of the things that happens on our site inadvertently that we don't tend to think about is as we develop, we drop the water table through all the infrastructure we put in, and then trees become drought stress. And you add in the weather changes that we have right now, and that becomes even more severe. So is there opportunities holistically to keep water available in the soil and landscape system that we have? And then do we, through that, also get other benefits? But we're optimizing stormwater management. We're converting lawn to other kinds of landscape in strategic ways, and that might not only optimize our stormwater system, but help reduce downslope flooding. We see that. I hear about that anecdotally in the landscape. We can create pollinator habitat. We can, by conserving trees, we, improve, the comfort for being out here in the summer. We support songbirds. If anybody's reading Doug Tallamy and about the interaction between tree species and caterpillar availability and songbird populations, those are interrelated, and we're managing views. Is this how we sell these systems to the client? Sometimes. We probably start with views and all the things we normally talk about design, but these are all the layers in the cake that we're building here. That's really interesting. So that's a place to start. Second point, this middle zone in ecology and slowing water down. We don't do that in design. In design, traditionally, we're taught to move water away from the places we build as fast as possible. But that's not what happens in nature for stable, resilient systems. So here's 2 examples. It's the Delaware River. And the middle zone is this floodplain zone that you see with the gravel bar here. And when the water's high, this is all kind of familiar idea. It spreads out across the floodplain, and the water slows down as it moves through this floodplain terrace. And we remove these from the landscape when we build traditionally. Here's an example from Mount Cuba, down in Delaware, not too far away. And this is a vernal pool. This probably, if I took this picture now instead of in January or December, this would be flooded. This is habitat for frogs and salamanders. It's an ephemeral pond that naturally occurs. It's a vanishing or increasingly rare type of wooded wetland. And this, again, is that middle zone. And again, we typically remove these when we design. We remove these from the landscape. And so one of our challenges is to think about how we can continue to provide these in developed landscapes in ways that we can tolerate or that we're comfortable, in community-based places. I'm going to give you one more example, then I'll start to show what that might look like. So on the left is a beaver meadow. This is the kind of wet floodplain or wet marsh that develops upstream of a beaver dam. And what they're finding in the science out west is that these places, when the beaver manage the river system, you get increased flood resistance. These manage flood, you would get increased drought. I should have had the word tolerance in there, increased drought tolerance, and you get increased fire resistance. And in the picture on the right, this is from Northern Ontario where I was last summer. This is a landscape that burned about 3 years ago, and here's the beaver dam. We tend to think it's all about the dam. The beaver dam is only half of it. It's the network of channels upstream of the dam that act like a giant sponge that are really adding this functionality. And so you can see here that the upland area burned. The stream corridor that's beaver managed did not. And so how can we learn from these dynamic systems in order to be able to build the same kind of resilience into our sites? And this is the active discussion that's happening on the cutting edge of this that we could apply if we can find the information. That's the quest, how to find that. So I'm going to give you two examples, and these are just part of an ongoing discussion. This is a library that was built in 2013 out in Illinois. The building is built into the hillside. They had a kind of familiar dilemma. Do we build into the hillside or do we build at the bottom of the slope? And they chose to move the building into the hillside, and the program's all on one level. And at the top, there's a green roof, and all of this is meadow. This is part of the prairie landscape in the bigger picture. So if you look at this head house, when you're up at the top, you've got this meadow. Well, there's a concern that it would burn. That we're on the edge of the prairie. There might be an interest in managing the landscape through fire if they're going to do that, or that just fires might naturally occur. And so the roof is designed, this landscape, take this as an analog for the site, is designed for fire resistance. So here there's a couple things happening. The waterproofing turns up behind the CMU block at the parapet and at the head house, so it's protected from heat. And at the base of this overburden, the landscape system that overlies the building, you have detention, which is the water you normally get draining through the soil, and then you get retention. There's an inch of water held passively at the bottom of this. This is partly water-wise irrigation. The water's always available. It's topped up through a little water level controller, just like a float tank and a toilet, and it just maintains this. You could harvest water for it if you want. It maintains this inch of water. But it's also keeping the roof cool. It's protecting it from heat. If for any reason this meadow were to burn, that's not going to affect. And it's much less likely to burn because the water's available and it's not dry. It's not going into kind of summer dormancy as much. It's green and growing. And if you've ever volunteered at a bird and watched the fire crews try to start a fire, you can't burn green vegetation very easily. So can we learn from that? Can we come back to that? Here's another one, total contrast. This is in Hoboken. This is a redevelopment site. And downtown or old parts of Hoboken have a familiar problem, which is that the storm sewer system is undersized. And when you get these outside of coastal flooding, just take a big rainstorm like we've had the past couple months. You get these big storms that come through, and water can't get down the storm sewer fast enough, and so you get nuisance flooding. So if you're going to redevelop, this particular site has a single office building of about 3 stories, like you see on the right-hand side of this little inset, and the rest is parking lot. And the development, we worked on this with Ernie McHenry, was looking at overbuild plus a healthcare building, a parking garage with an elevated park, and a residential tower, and then mixed use at the ground floor. So kind of a familiar mixed use development. And the resiliency discussion goes like this. This blue line is sort of kind of the 100-year floodplain. So there's a whole bunch of facade approaches to floodproofing that come into play. You also have this upper park, and so what we're talking about is the site is a vertical watershed. Think about what was happening in that floodplain picture for the Delaware and then turn that vertically. Can we use these places mid-level in the building, mid-level in our site, if this were a greenfield site, to catch and hold water. So rainfall comes, we delay it here, and even if the delay is minutes to hours, does that help reduce the frequency of flooding on the street? And then simultaneously, can we create places of refuge, places of prospect? You could come up, you get a great view in regular weather. You could come up here and get a great view over your neighborhood. In bad weather, maybe this is a more comfortable place to hang out. And then how does that start to affect the fifth floor, fourth floor programming in these buildings? Does it? Absolutely. So all of this becomes, everything is connected to everything else. And so this is what was happening, the idea that we could catch this water, hold it here, and then the North Hudson Sewer Authority actually required a data-driven remote smart controller here, which would be the valve at the primary roof drain. The roof drain's connected to a single point, and this valve was connected to a dashboard, and the sewer authority could look at the capacity of all the sewer pipes in the Hoboken area, and when they knew there was volume available, they would open that and let the water out. So they manage this like a freeway. They're managing the traffic, the water through their system. How cool is that? So, and then last, I come back to dynamic composition. So I'm going to jump all the way down to the planting scale, and then we'll come back up to the site scale. If you're all still with me, this is like drinking from a fire hose. I get it. So I took this picture at the Navy Yard. I love this composition. I think this is done by the Horticultural Society. This is Camassia. It's the spring flowering bulb is sprinkled through the rain garden, and it's here. It can move. It's not being asked to be the primary plant, but it's adding a seasonal beauty. And so this planting composition is working with the dynamics of the plant community and not as just a fixed arrangement. It's going to move a little bit. That's okay. Here's another one. This planting design is done with the intent that you've got some initial texture and height contrast, but the pink cone, echinacea, the purple coneflower here, that can move through and will move through this design and acts like a mobile Band-Aid, and that's okay. Can we have stealth diversity? We talk in my office about like how we add diversity in ways that people don't notice, and it still looks clean and tidy the way people are used to thinking about planting. And so do we combine similar looking species that maybe behave just enough differently that they can knit together and keep this landscape thriving, even if, you know, the weather's a little bit drier, a little bit wetter year to year? And I'll have this example. This is from the Krishna Center of Nanotechnology at the University of Pennsylvania. They call this their little piece of the highlight, and it was a little natural area. Again, this is a green roof, but I've been looking at it for 10 or 11 years. So I have some interesting photographic evidence of what happens. Here it was intentionally planted, and there was some seeding that was meadow seed that was meant to be used elsewhere on the project, and the contractor couldn't imagine that the meadow seed wouldn't belong on the meadow planting, so they put half the seed down here before anybody realized what was going on, which was fortuitous because we got to watch what happened. And so here, after 10 years, this has become one of the most biodiverse plantings in an urban setting that's not like a remnant natural, like in terms of an intentional design that I know of. And looking at how this plant community evolves and knits together. And so you're seeing here a mix of plants that were intentionally planted, plants that came up from seed, and plants that volunteered. And so what happens is in dry weather, this yellow flowered coreopsis you see, this was not the original species. The original species, there was also coreopsis, it was a different species. It did not reproduce, and it died out after about 3 years. But what came up was the sister species that came up from seed. And this is acting like a mobile Band-Aid. And so there were probably some weeds that were taken out. Maybe it was a little bit dry. We've had some real prolonged dry weather, and so it's acting like a patch kit that's coming in, and you get this burst of bloom. And that's what we want. We've given the plant community the tools to self-adapt. And in a wet year, early on, we had this. This is grape blue lobelia. We did not plant this. This came up as a volunteer out of the seed bank. Either it came in the pots or it came somehow inadvertently in the seed mix. But how cool is that, that in a wet year, they actually had the irrigation system turned up too high. We get a flush of a different native plant that came in and said, I'm stepping up. And we looked at that and we said, this is beautiful, but this is not, we should turn your irrigation system down. And we haven't seen it since. But that's resiliency. That's what we want out of our designs. And so our question is, how do we build that in a way where we can still have all the beauty and the curated artfulness we want, and yet still have this kind of functionality? So I'll end with an example on a social end. This is Sierra Green, meant to be an elevated park, envisioned by Brandywine Realty Trust as a vertical neighborhood that gives these stupendous views, and people come up and they feel free to do things here that they would not do at the ground level. You could put your purse down and walk over to say hi to a friend, and no one's going to run off with it. You can hang out and have your picnic and let your kids run around, and there's a certain relaxation that's different subtly than what happens on the ground. But what interested me is that this design, like many, is a familiar story. They could not afford everything that was originally intended in schematic, and they only built part of it. And Brandywine came through afterwards and started putting things in for the, it was built in 2014, and for the next, 5 years, they kept adding things, and they added a tent for events because they wanted to have a tent. So up came the tent. And they've gone through a couple iterations of different sizes of tents, and they put in a big screen TV, and they put in a dog park in the foreground, and they put in this pop-up restaurant, where you can get your beer and your burgers or your food for their Sunset Shelter series. And it's easy to think about this as a collection of stuff, and as a designer to say, oh my goodness, like all this stuff is just thrown at our design. But what's actually fascinating is it's a living place. And if you think about this as a living place that the owner is using to adapt to the needs from the requests from the tenants, they can test drive. They test drove the beer garden one summer before they built for real, for permanently. Like, that's what we want. In a way, that's a success story. And so how do we as designers think about our places, our sites, as frameworks, essential frameworks that allow the community to continue to invest in them, to continue to enhance them in ways that make sense and help them remain relevant and respond to the way people are actually inhabiting place. And that is also resilience. And I'm really curious about this. I'm really interested in this as a way to approach master planning and as a way to approach design. And does it allow us to keep in contact with our clients? Absolutely. That's what we also want. So there's a couple of contrasts. We have times like during COVID or during quiet times when people are inhabiting this in a small scale way. And then you have big events. And during COVID, people would come up and they'd watch the big screen to watch like the basketball game. People move the furniture around, and that's also what we want. And so when we think about extreme weather, if we go back to the kinds of things that are happening for our coastal communities or communities that do have flooding, can we think about this kind of dynamic that is not only like event versus daily social? Can we think about this kind of dynamic as a way to respond to extreme events? Can we mobilize our public spaces or our privately managed open space, privately managed, publicly accessible space, which is another kind of new for a city, emerging possibility. Can we mobilize them for community, like emergency preparedness response? So, all up for good discussion. I'll pause here.
This was really great. Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm going to open up and see if anyone has any questions that they want to bring up. Take 5-10 minutes.
I have a question. I'm an architect, but we have landscape architects in my office, and we've been running into a lot concerns from clients about maintenance of some of these landscapes that they don't understand or haven't maintained before. What kinds of things have you been sharing with them in terms of like educating the client?
So I think that's an awesome question. And honestly, like it's the first thing everybody asks, how do we deal with this? So there's kind of 3 layers to the answer. And honestly, it's one that's obviously still an active conversation. One is, in a big picture, we need a new maintenance paradigm. So, if mow, blow, go is the way that most like commercial landscapes are maintained, we need another paradigm that is like, trim, overseed, you know, impulse plant or something like that, that we can brand, that people can latch onto and understand. And then what that needs beyond that is actually like a maintenance template, a contracting template, so that the procurement process is in line with the designer's vision. I think a lot of times it's not that people don't want to maintain differently or aren't open to it. It's that the process for the way that current maintenance happens is so embedded, they don't have the available tools. So that's something we're actually working on. So yes,
Great. Thank you.
keep going. I would also say two other things. One is that if you get this kind of planting like I was showing you, I'm going to share my screen again. Ideally, this actually, compared to say a conventional lawn, you could maintain this in very similar ways. This is low maintenance. It's actually more forgiving because you don't see the weeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
we've been trying to make that case, and it's just like, well, how am I gonna cut it? That's a lot of stuff to cut down. Like, no.
I mean, you mow your lawn, you string trim things. I see all sorts of contractor string trimming stuff. So I think a string trimmer is our friend. And I think the other thing you can tell people is you don't have to recognize every plant. Like really, like you don't recognize that seedling, send me a photo. Like we'll ID it for you. What matters is that you recognize like the 6 most pernicious weeds.
Got it. That's good. That's a good
And
point. Yeah.
And if you can recognize those, then like you're ahead of 90% of the problems. So yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Anyone else?
I was going to ask a quick question, although this could be an entire other session, but I think part of it, and maybe you're sort of already sharing it, but the thing I feel like we struggle with is what you hinted at a little bit, which is the expectation of how do we make the aesthetic of a natural, diverse landscape fit with what people think of as saying, oh, this is a great idea and we want to use native plants and we want to do biodiversity, but we also want it to look like a typical corporate, golf course campus.
Yeah.
And when does that change happen, when people look at that and say, this looks like an unsustainable landscape, as opposed to, no, it looks, we want it to look exactly the same, but be different, whatever they want their something.
Yeah.
How do I mean, there's dissertations in there, but that's sort of my thought that I feel like we struggle with, is trying to say,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's you're right. That could also, Jonathan, be like a whole dissertation or a whole discussion. But I think the 2 big things are, one, the edges matter the most. If the edges can be super clean and tidy, you keep your lawn at the edge. You keep, it's not you rid all your lawn. You keep the lawn at the edge. You keep there's some nice examples of this again down at the Navy Yard, or if you go out to some of the local arboreta, you'll see them doing this, this kind of like nice frame. And then the middle can be a little bit wilder. And then the second piece for this is like stealth diversity is an awesome tool. And you can have something that looks on the surface very familiar, but you're building in more adaptability, because most people can't tell the difference between a foam flower and a coral bell. 2 very similar looking species for plants. So.
All right, Paul, looks like you have a question.
Yes, thanks, Laura. This is really thought-provoking for us architects. I know you run into all this time, right? The landscape is the last thing on the site, and that's when the money runs out. So how do you embed, this is obviously a very important part of the experience and the ecology of a project. How do you embed that more, tricks for architects on how, how do you do that so that we can do that with things that we think are important too?
What a great question. Thank you, Paul. So 2 things. The first is, I'd say, invest a little bit of time right in pre-design before the schematic design is nailed down, to look at the possibilities and bring in your structural engineer or bring in your landscape architect or your civil and just say, before we nail anything down, let's talk about the synergies we can build on. And if you look at that Hoboken example that I showed you with the overbuild, that's exactly what happened there. And that project would never have figured that out if we hadn't taken like 2 really focused charrette sessions to talk about what was needed. And then the second thing is to make sure that the value of the efficiencies from integrated design is actually reflected in your cost estimate. So, you know, if you're putting on a green roof, or you're adding a meadow, or you're doing something else with your site that's going to absorb water and reduce runoff, make sure that that's reflected in the civil engineer's sizing for the stormwater system. Because they don't automatically. You think they would just automatically do it. They don't. You have to prompt them. And then when they want to take it out later, then there's a cost, right? You say, oh, well, could I VE that? And you're like, well, sure you could, but then you're going to have to add 25% to your footprint of your stormwater. And they're like, oh, well, no, we don't want to actually take you up on that option. So if you can talk about co-benefits and get people excited about those sort of multiple value added outcomes, then you're talking. So what sold the developer at the Hoboken project was saying, I think you have a golf course effect with this elevated park. You know, they could get more rent. And they figured it was 17% more rent. That might be high. Maybe it's 14, but somewhere between 10 and 17-ish% more rent for their floor space because it was adjacent to that outdoor amenity. And that sold it right there. You could see this hesitation, and they're like, oh, awesome, sign us up. You know, other places it might be, we don't have to disturb as much of the site. We can balance our cut fill, sure. Is that?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Laura.
Sure.
And Brian, I thought you had a question, but it looks like you lowered your hand. Did you want to say anything?
I might be going into a train tunnel, but I'll try and ask it real quick. Well, actually, it wasn't a question. It was more of a comment. I wanted to echo Laura's comment about institutions that fight with sort of more natural landscaping in terms of maintenance cost. At a large institution that did exactly that. You know, we had a mix of it, but VE'd to turf grass. And some universities need the turf grass for student sitting area. You can't sit on the natural and wild areas as easily. But they specifically cited, sorry for the background. But they cited the maintenance costs as the reason why. So I'd love to see that transformation for large universities.
Totally agree. And I think it's because our maintenance paradigm is based on the traditional horticulture, which says you need to hand weed everything and you need to control everything. And that's exactly why we need to shift it. And I'd say the other thing is start small. Like, it's so easy for designers to say it's all or nothing. You know, get rid of all your lawn. I'm like, no, don't even do that. Like, start small, start at the edge, start in a way that people can kind of feel comfortable getting their toe in the water, and then work out the kinks. Involve the facilities people. They're often open to more than you realize if you can just address their specific concerns. So have that conversation early, and then you can move forward.